Today, we're tackling a question that has, for more than half a century, been at the very heart of India's economic story. It seems simple, but as we're about to see, figuring out the answer has been an epic quest.
I mean, really think about it. How do you draw a clear line that separates the poor from the not poor? It sounds straightforward, right? But where you draw that line changes everything. It shapes policy, it directs aid, and it tells us how we're doing as a nation of well over 1 billion people.
Okay, so before we dive into India's specific journey, we have to get on the same page about what poverty even means, because it really comes in two main flavors.
On one side, you've got absolute poverty. This is about survival, plain and simple. It means lacking the absolute bare minimum essentials, like food, clean water, and a roof over your head. It's a fixed bar. Then, on the other side, there's relative poverty. This is all about where you stand compared to everyone else in your society. You might have food and shelter, but if you're so far behind the average that you can't participate in a normal life, you're considered relatively poor. It's a measure of inequality. Now, for the rest of this journey, we are going to be focusing exclusively on absolute poverty, because that has been the central 50-year-long challenge for India's policymakers. How do you create one single yardstick for basic survival in one of the most diverse countries on Earth?
And wow, what a journey it has been. Starting all the way back in the early 70s, a whole series of expert committees were put together, each one tasked with drawing and then redrawing this incredibly important line. Each built on what came before and, as we'll see, sometimes they completely tore it all down and started over. To really get what these committees were trying to do, we need to be crystal clear on what exactly they were all trying to define.
Okay, so this is absolutely crucial. In India, the poverty line isn't about how much money you earn. It's about how much money you spend. It's about consumption. The core question is, what is the minimum amount of money a person needs to spend every single month just to get the bare essentials to live?
The very first attempt to do this scientifically by the Tendulkar and Rangarajan Committee came up with a pretty simple but powerful idea. They decided to anchor the entire definition of poverty to one thing: food, specifically calories. They figured a person needs, on average, 2,250 calories a day. So the poverty line was just the amount of money you'd need to spend to buy food that gives you those calories. Simple as that.
But here's the thing about India. A single, one-size-fits-all number just doesn't work for a country that complex. So the next couple of decades were all about adding some much-needed nuance.
The Alaga Committee was the first to make a big tweak. They pointed out, quite logically, that life in a village often involves a lot more physical labor than life in a city, so it requires more energy, right? They created two different calorie benchmarks, a higher one for rural India and a slightly lower one for urban India. Then, in '93, the Lokdawala Committee said, hold on, even that's not enough. They argued that the cost of living and even what people eat is totally different in, say, a coastal state like Kerala compared to a northern state like Punjab. So their big idea was, let's calculate a unique poverty line for each state first and then combine them to get a national picture.
So, for more than 30 years, this whole idea of calories being the bedrock of the poverty line was the standard. But by the 2000s, it was obvious that India had changed a lot, and the old way of thinking just wasn't cutting it anymore. It was time for a major rethink.
And you don't just have to take my word for it. The Tendulkar Committee's own report was brutally honest. They basically said that using a shopping list of what people bought back in 1973 to measure poverty in 2009 was, and I quote, outdated. People's basic needs had evolved beyond just getting enough calories.
So, the Tendulkar Committee pretty much flipped the script. First, they ditched the strict focus on calories. Second, and this was a huge deal, they started including what people were spending on education and health as essential items. Third, they got smarter about collecting data, asking people to remember their spending over different time frames to get a more accurate picture. And finally, they created a single new urban shopping basket to be the benchmark for the entire country.
And this is what that new line looked like. In rural India, if you spent less than 447 rupees a month on everything, you were considered poor. Let that sink in. That's less than 15 rupees a day for your food, your health, your education, everything. But if you think that was the end of the story, you'd be mistaken. This new method wasn't the final word. In fact, it kicked off a huge controversy, which led to another committee and a whole new set of rules just a few years later.
So in 2012, the government set up the Rangarajan Committee.
Their entire job was to take a really hard look at the Tendulkar formula and figure out if there was a better way to do it.
Let's put them side by side, because the differences are pretty telling. The Rangarajan Committee actually went back to using calories as a baseline. They also went back to having separate baskets for rural and urban areas. But they also expanded the list of essential non-food items even more, including things like rent, clothing, and transportation.
And what was the result of all these changes? A much, much higher poverty line. The number for rural India more than doubled, jumping to 972 rupees a month. And what that meant in reality was that under this new system, millions more people were suddenly classified as poor compared to the old Tendulkar line.
But here's the most fascinating part of this whole story. While all these experts were debating the technicalities of how to measure poverty, the data itself was showing an incredibly clear trend. Using their own much higher bar for poverty, the Rangarajan Committee found that in just 2 years, the share of people in poverty dropped from over 38% to under 30%. That means 91.6 million people were lifted out of poverty in 2 years. It's a staggering number, no matter which formula you use.
Which brings us to today and leaves us with a final, big question. This journey is clearly not over. As India's economy grows and changes, our idea of what counts as a minimum standard of living is going to change with it. So what should the next poverty line measure? Should it include access to the internet, a safe environment, good healthcare? The quest to define poverty continues.